Hello, everybody. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes. Our speaker, Gill Bedi, is going to sign in soon. We're just having some technical difficulties. If everybody could be just a little patient, we'd appreciate that. Anyone signing in from West Coast or Alberta, a very good morning. And anyone signing in from Australia, a very good evening or late evening. We're doing this from multiple time zones today, so it should be interesting. I think we're almost there. Yay. And we have Jill. Hello. Okay, maybe we can, Conway, do you want to kick it off?
Sure, absolutely. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Pharmala Biotech FDA Guidance webinar. Today, we'll be talking about navigating through FDA guidance, as well as the TGA, and what that looks like in different jurisdictions. I'm now going to kick it off to Harpreet and let our lovely panelists introduce themselves.
Thank you very much. So we're very proud to host this through Pharmala Biotech. I'm the Vice President of Research at Pharmala Biotech. We're a Canadian company that's focused on the manufacturing and sales of generic MDMA to support our wonderful researchers such as Jill and Leah and the others. And we also work on identifying novel analogs of MDMA at Pharmala that will have a beneficial safety pharmacology. Today, with many thanks to FDA having published the first guidance in this domain, I'm very happy to have Jill and Leah with us. Jill and Leah, if you could please introduce yourselves.
Yeah, Leah, do you want to go first?
Yes, please.
Sure. So my name is Leah Mayo. I'm the Parker Psychedelics Research Chair here in Calgary. So I just moved to Canada last fall. I spent some time in Sweden and before that in the US. So I've been dealing with regulatory issues across several countries. And After moving here, we just got our first CIHR grant to support a clinical trial on psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for alcohol use disorder. So kind of knee deep in all the regulatory hurdles for that.
Right. Hi, everyone. My name's Gill Bedi. I'm the head of substance use research at Origin, which is a youth mental health service in Melbourne, Australia, and also a principal research fellow at the University of Melbourne. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I have mainly focused on research area and spent a lot of time working in human behavioural pharmacology and functional neuroimaging. More recently, since moving back to Australia, I was in the US for 10 years. Since moving back to Australia, I've been working on a range of clinical trial approaches, and at the moment we are hopefully approaching the starting point of a trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for social anxiety and autism.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, we've seen that the regulatory landscape has changed and is continuously evolving over a period of time. This graphic is from Alpha Psychedelics. They've done a pretty good job of keeping everybody up to date. We have seen that, you know, over the last, well, I want to say almost century, since the first time that these drugs were used, and today we see that there's a lot of preclinical data that showed that these molecules might be toxic. Of course, there was also evidence which resulted, the toxicity is what resulted in them being classified as Schedule 1 substances. Over the last 30 years, we've seen MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, have done a lot of work to demonstrate the potential of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and help create a new narrative. The efficacy of racemic MDMA for patients with severe PTSD has been demonstrated through several phase 2 and 1 phase 3 trial. And the interim results of the second pivotal phase 3 trial also support the efficacy and safety. But what's very interesting is that last year in Canada, Health Canada actually allowed the special access program created the special access program allowing health practitioners, such as licensed physicians, to request for use on a case-by-case basis drugs such as MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, and DMT. This year, Australia Therapeutic Goods Administration has said that since July 1st, psychiatrists in Australia would be able to prescribe MDMA and psilocybin for controlled clinical use. Now, there are differences between these, and what I've done on the next slide here is just sort of highlight things that are published by each of the regulatory bodies. Now, in terms of indication, we see that Canada is saying it should be patient with serious or life-threatening indication where conventional treatments have failed. Quality, Health Canada clearly calls out the drug substance and product needs to be GMP, and it should be from a drug manufacturer with a dealer's license under CDSA. The prescribing doctor can be a healthcare practitioner, and these are psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So Gill and Leah, I would really like to hear your thoughts on, you know, what your experience has been in this domain and how that has either helped or hurt either of you in either of the countries. Now, set and setting, again, there's no guidance that's written in the documents that have been published. Australia, MDMA is only for PTSD. Oh, that should have been psilocybin, my bad. Psilocybin for TRD and not PTSD for TRD. The quality is not clearly defined. The general assumption, though, is it could be GMP. It's not written in any of the guidance documents we've seen so far. The prescribing doctor, there's a difference. And with that, I'll open the floor. So Leah and Gill, if you guys have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, I guess I would say primarily that the TGA's announcement in February was something of a surprise. Almost everyone involved. As many people will know, there was an interim decision announced in October, the year before, that indicated that the application would not be approved, yet it then was. So I think since the announcement was made in February, there's been a lot of scrambling around from lots of different parties trying to catch up with this unexpected decision. You know, July 1st has been and gone, and there was not much happened, and to my knowledge there hasn't been anyone yet who has actually received authorized prescribing status. So, there's applications in the work, but there isn't anyone who's actually got that approval yet. So it's a slow start, which is not surprising given the amount of lead time there was, which was not very much, and given the fact that there was a lot of details. In fact, almost all of the details were unspecified in the announcement. So the other thing, I guess, to say from the perspective of research, for us, it actually it hasn't helped at all, unfortunately. So we, because we're not investigating MDMA for PTSD, that's the only indication that the bifurcated scheduling applies under a Schedule 8 for. So because it's a different indication for our main study that we're working on at the moment, it doesn't affect our situation at all. We're still dealing with MDMA as a Schedule 9 drug.
Okay. Leah, any experience or thoughts with Canadian special access, or just how the regulations are here?
Yeah, so I mean, in Canada, it feels a little kind of amorphous because there's not a restriction on what specific indications it can be for, even really, what, medications might be best for what indications. There's no, and it might be interesting to chat after, Jill, about what becoming like a registered psychiatrist with this special approval actually means, because this is another thing, is that there's no kind of training or special sort of, way to give information to the people who are prescribing this. It's just a healthcare practitioner who knows how to fill out the paperwork, which I think is really interesting. And then kind of the lack of guidance on the setting is kind of very different than how we have to do things in clinical trials, where we have to identify every little piece of this. So because it's so broad and general, it's really a little bit difficult to track. So we are trying to work on kind of collecting some real world observational data of people who have actually gone through this SAP program, just to get a feel for like what's actually happening and what outcomes could be. Because right now it's not really known what's going on in the real world with this.
Yeah, no, that's really insightful, because I think the set and setting is something that's not really well spoken about or defined. And I want to get into the US aspect, because the US guidance does have some, language towards that. We are seeing, of course, a regulatory landscape change in US as well. November 2020, we saw that Oregon became the first state to legalize psilocybin-assisted therapy and to decriminalize the personal possession of drugs. May 2023, in a historic vote, the Colorado folks passed the Proposition 122, becoming the second state in the US to legalize psychedelics and treatment centers for their use. So it was a very pleasant surprise, almost to the date last month, that we saw FDA release their first draft guidance. A draft guidance essentially is a non-binding document, but it is also open for comment from the public. They've provided their recommendations in terms of CMC, non-clinical, clinical, abuse potential, and clinical setting, which was very, very exciting. From Pharmala's perspective, I can tell everybody, the CMC portion was not surprising for us at all. Requiring product to be GMP is and should be a standard practice across any drug use, whether it's clinical, prescription, or any human consumption, really, because it's a testament to ensuring the patient and the consumer gets the highest quality without the impurities, without the risk of, adverse events because of the drug and impurities in them. But the non-clinical, clinical abuse potential, and especially the abuse potential, caught my eye. And Jill, I would really like to, pick your brain a little bit on that aspect, because it's the first time we really have a guidance that speaks to psychedelics and abuse potential. So maybe we'll start with the non-clinical. FDA is focused on the 5-HT2 receptor binding and agonist action of drugs. Through clinical research, at least published research, we've read that, even MDMA and psilocybin, LSD, have transient increases in blood pressure in humans at any clinical setting. So in your experience working with these drugs, I mean, Jill, you've got, MDMA assisted therapy trial coming up. Leah, you've got your psilocybin trial. How big a role do you think these drugs and these cardiac events play? And I've heard, conflicting feedback from different researchers in this domain when we were at the Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts as well.
I can only speak for MDMA. I'm really not an expert in the other psychedelics. So, but with MDMA, we definitely see increases in transient increases in blood pressure, which can be really quite marked in some individuals. So one of the things that I think is really important is that the vast majority of data that we have on MDMA is in really highly selected populations. And so particularly the experimental studies, the lab studies, are all largely healthy young adults for the most part. We've got a bit broader range in the clinical trials that have happened for PTSD, but obviously we still have very, very low levels of acceptance into clinical trials, and that's, as it should be at this quite early stage. It's important that we have safety protocols in place. And so, I mean, from our perspective, it doesn't, we will continue doing what we've always done, which is excluding people with cardiac vulnerabilities from the studies, and also doing an ECG before people start to see if there are any clinically significant abnormalities. So from us, it's kind of just standard process.
Okay.
But I guess one other thing is that, we're interested with the TGA changes, that there will be, I mean, there's no way for the MDMA assisted psychotherapy studies, there's less than 10% of participants have been accepted into the trials. And so there's no way that's going to happen in the clinic. And so I think it's going to be the potential risks of adverse events, including cardiac adverse events, are much higher because the populations, I think, will be much more complex and mixed.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm just going to echo what Jill said, because the same for us. I mean, in clinical trials, we always do ECGs, we monitor blood pressure and heart rate. We carefully select the people who come in to our clinical trials, and I think that's always an important thing to point out is that even when we have clinical populations in a clinical trial, they are a selected population. So we are screening out a lot of people who might have potential for these adverse events. So again, like Jill said, to see how this is going to be implemented in the clinic will be interesting, and hopefully those same sorts of kind of safety parameters are kept in mind.
Yeah, and I think what you're both saying is very important, right? Because both special access and the TGA's announcement do not define this aspect of the use in the clinical setting. The hope is that the doctors are reading and understanding the risks and ensuring that when TGA is going, or when the psychiatrists in Australia are going through the HRAC approval or the TGA approval, that the committee is reviewing the protocols, are actually making sure that these safety guardrails are present. And then the same is happening in Canada. Because as special access suppliers, we know that it takes a long time. Although the announcement came out last year that it is now available through special access, it wasn't until sometime, early summer of this year that you actually had the first supply happen, because there just wasn't, the framework for them to understand how to approve this and how to take this forward and how to get the supply even. So that's very interesting, and I'm glad that the FDA is allowing this. Do you think that I know we are not in the US, but do you think that in the US, this is going to help them define not only their clinical trials, but any other research that they want to do? And if I don't think US will have anything like special access, but if they do you think it will also influence that?
I mean, I think one thing that this kind of brings up again is this point of like the people who were able to prescribe, particularly outside of the clinical trials, like, again, what is their training? What is their education, right? Because as clinical trialists, we are kind of raised to be very cautious and careful and, really pay attention to these things. But if you don't have that experience in that context where you're administering these sorts of drugs to people, or a lot of experience with psychedelics, will that same caution be put into place? And, we don't know. Like I said, I don't think it'll change a whole lot in the clinical trial context because things are so carefully monitored, but it's kind of what happens outside that I think is perhaps more concerning.
Right. Jill, the abuse potential, I found that very interesting. And you have a lot of experience with, substance abuse and abuse of drugs. In your experience and from what you know of the different psychedelics, how much abuse potential do you think there exists? And then, how should that be addressed? In a clinical setting, it's easier to address because it's very controlled. It's in an environment. The patient is with you while you give them the drugs. They're not taking it home, But based on the true potential of these drugs that might exist, how does that even translate to what's happening in Australia, under Schedule 8? And then Leah, maybe if you could also add some thoughts to Canada from that perspective.
Yeah, it was interesting, the abuse potential section. And one thing I think that's worth noting, when I guess most of us think about abuse of drugs, we often think more about substance use disorders and development of patterns of dependence. And reading between the lines, my understanding of the FDA use of the term abuse is really any use outside of a medical setting. So the potential for it to be diverted for any kind of recreational use at all. And that's something that we wouldn't necessarily consider to be within that abuse framework, because it doesn't represent necessarily substance use disorder or patterns of dependent use. So I guess more broadly, we know that these are drugs. We know that psilocybin, LSD, particularly MDMA, are drugs that are abused to the extent that they're used recreationally in the wild, and people use them for a range of different reasons. Certainly the abuse potential of them is not comparable to some of the drugs like psychostimulants, alcohol, tobacco, opioids, for instance. There have been a proportion of recreational ecstasy users who do develop ecstasy use disorder. And that's a little bit higher than you would certainly see for hallucinogen, your typical psychedelics, where the use is very frequently instrumental. So people are using it for a particular purpose in a particular context, rather than using it in a more kind of uncontrolled way, which you do sometimes see for MDMA. I have clinically seen a couple of people in my entire clinical career where there was patterns of really uncontrolled use of classical psychedelics, but it's very, very unusual. And my sort of sense is that it's not your average person that you're talking about in the first place. So look, I think it's interesting guidelines. I don't think that these I do think there are a range of risks associated with these therapeutic approaches, but I don't think that people running out and taking a whole bunch of psychedelics is necessarily going to be one of the more concerning ones.
Right.
Yeah, and then I think one of the things too, like bringing it back to the clinical trial context, we often have a limit of like how many times people can have tried these drugs before. So I think that's something too, that when these things are out, like these treatments are out in the wild, are physicians still going to have that same sort of a screening process where if someone's, taken MDMA, several times recreationally, is that really the best candidate for this MDMA-based treatment? I mean, we don't know the answer to that scientifically, but I think those are things that we'll have to think of because, history of use can really inform what is possible going forward.
Yeah. And I'll ask a question that I know a lot of people have been wondering as well, is will psychedelics, especially things like mushrooms, which or magic mushrooms or recreational use of mushrooms, will these ever become recreational? And if they do become recreational, do we worry about the abuse potential of these drugs now? If you guys have any thoughts on that.
I think my concern, I kind of echo some of how the whole cannabis rollout happened, right? Is like, we don't really know exactly the best context for providing these as a medical treatment, but they're being touted as a really kind of effective medical treatment. So I worry about them becoming recreationally legal ahead of us really having the knowledge that we need to use them in a medical context, because then you get people who, for whatever reason, may not have access to them in the medical context or may not want them in the medical context to be using them recreationally when they really should have that medical support around them. So I think for me, that's the biggest issue around the kind of legality. Whether or not they should be recreational, that's a totally different discussion, or legal recreation, that's a totally different discussion. But just from my experience as working in a medical context, that's the concern I have.
Yeah.
I would agree with Leah totally on that front. And I think, the reality is that magic mushrooms are already abused. And even though we do see patterns of people using them for more instrumental self-development, that sort of thing, we also see, teenagers using them for a bit of fun. And to me, the risks associated with these drugs are quite different to what, as I said, some of the other drugs where patterns of dependence or compulsive use is more likely. The concerns are really around psychiatric adverse events. And also misadventure, which is something that I think in the uncontrolled settings, particularly with young people who may not understand some of the implications of the medications they're taking, we sometimes see people putting themselves at risk just by virtue of doing dumb stuff while they're high. So that's kind of another thing that we're concerned about. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great segue. I think the next question I really had was FDA in their clinical section or recommendation for clinical section says has actually defined who can prescribe this and under what setting. They've gone into the details of having 2 people being there with the patient so that you have a senior doctor, and the secondary person can be someone who's graduated with 1 year of experience in the psychiatric domain. And I think that sort of also sets, the stage for how this should be used, because it's not the drug, it's the drug with the therapy that's been helping a lot of people. And that's what MAPS has also demonstrated. So when you're doing it on that recreational stage, do you have that therapy? Do you have that support system? And then, with the transient increases in the blood pressure, I often wonder, do they have that support should something go the wrong way or not the right way, right? And that scares me personally as a person, but also as a scientist. And so when you're designing these clinical trials and when you're doing all of this research, what are some of the challenges that you face? How do you define the support system? For your clinical trials in different countries, like in Canada, is there a standard practice that is being followed, or in Australia, is there a standard practice that's being followed, or is everybody across the world using the MAPS protocol?
I think it depends on the context. So there's some interesting kind of ideas in the regulations about the psychotherapeutic support component, and kind of saying like, well, it doesn't matter, and we should kind of separate this out, which is like a total 180 from like what's actually happening with the MAPS protocol, which has been given FDA breakthrough status, which is like there's this huge psychotherapeutic component that's not super clearly defined as to what really is what in it. So I think it's really interesting to get these sorts of guidance of, here we have something that has breakthrough status and this is what we think is going to be approved. And then suddenly, well, we don't really think that whole part of it might matter. I know in Canada, at least for us, when CAHR had this recent special announcement for psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, we had to have a psychotherapeutic component. It had to be clearly defined. So for us, that meant taking something that actually worked for the population that we are using, and then seeing if that psilocybin is more effective than that alone. And that's a little bit different than often what is talked about as psychotherapeutic support here, where it's just kind of integration, preparation and integration, whatever that entails to you. So it's really interesting to see where this is going to go, because I think the psychotherapeutic component has been under fire for a while. And I think that this recent announcement from the FDA was, at least for me, a bit unexpected.
So I think that great points that Leah made, and I think the nature of the psychotherapy is really one of the things that we just do not understand at all. And I guess that to me, as a clinical psychologist, there's a sort of disciplinary aspect to this as well, whereby some of the approaches that are being used have their roots in more psychodynamic kind of approaches. And part of that is just a function of the history, that a lot of the work that was done in the 60s and 70s. And then there was a really big gap. And now a lot of the people who have been setting up these studies have reached back in time through to the psychotherapeutic approaches that were used at those times, which not only were they influenced specifically by the history of use in a substance-assisted sort of setting, but also they were just influenced by the time. And so Whereas now we've, particularly within the clinical psychology field, there's much more of a focus on evidence-based practice, quite structured sort of approaches to therapy. And so for us, looking at some of the approaches, say, taken by MAPS, I mean, it's just bewildering in terms of the sheer range of things that are potentially able to be done. Also, a lot of the concepts are not coming from empirical background at all. So they're coming from historical precedent more than anything. So the use of nurturing touch, even the presence of two therapists is, from a conceptual perspective, coming from some background that may not be reflected in how we practice modern psychotherapy for the most part. So all of these things, I think, make it quite complex in terms of trying to understand what actually is the optimal psychotherapy platform for these medications. And then when we see something like, as Leah said, the FDA guidance, which really emphasizes trying to minimize the extra pharmacological influences as much as possible, which is very much within the model of a drug regulator, it really is bewildering because that's not the way it's been used. And it's also sort of, there's no happy medium there, wherein we could perhaps use more structured approaches that are more easily manualized and more replicable. We have the extreme of this it's manualized, but quite unstructured in many ways approach, versus the sort of try and justify why you're using psychotherapy at all approach, which is in the FDA guidance. So
yeah. Yeah, and I think from the FDA's perspective, and this is not to defend them really, but just no regulator has yet have to review documents that say it is drug plus psychotherapy. So this is the first time that's coming to them. They really want to know what is the value of that psychotherapy, and what should the duration of these administrations be? Should it be once every month and then a lot of psychotherapy without the drug between them? Should it just be once a month and then that's it, and then it's just psychotherapy? Like, I think all of those questions are unanswered. And when I read the guidance, that's how I interpreted it, is that they want that evidence. They want to see more research being done in this domain so you can actually call out the effects of the drug plus psychotherapy or the drug with no psychotherapy, and then truly show what's actually beneficial. Do you need to have a single person, two doctors, one patient? Can you do group setting? Can you not do group setting? And then when I look at the DSM-5, there's so many indications in there and so many crossovers. So how do you really identify the right patient population? And I think when I look at this guidance, I'm constantly wondering, how is Australia looking at it? How is TGA looking at it? How is Health Canada looking at it? Are we going to see more changes in the regulations coming forward in the coming months? So, yeah.
So I was just going to say, at least I agree with you that the FDA, I mean, our regulatory systems are just not equipped to deal with this kind of modality. At least the FDA tried, even though it's very clear that the details of psychotherapy is not their sort of remit. The TGA just said very clearly, we don't regulate psychotherapy. And so they just didn't really say anything about it, leaving evidence then in the hands of everyone else, which was kind of harsh.
Yeah. I mean, the College of Psychiatrists definitely have their work cut out for them. In terms of that a duration of the studies, I've always been curious, how do you identify when you're doing clinical research in this domain, what should be the duration of therapy? What should be the dose? I mean, especially with psilocybin, there's so much debate about, should it be microdose? Should it be 25 milligrams? So Leah, I would really like to hear your thoughts on that. And then with Gill, I'd really like to understand, how do you define different indications for MDMA, and then what the dose should be, considering what we know about these drugs today?
Yeah, so the whole microdose thing, last time I talked to someone about this in an interview, they told me you must be real fun at a party. So probably won't be making any friends, but this is something the science just doesn't back up microdosing as something that has been effective yet. We haven't designed the proper study that shows that it's effective in mood disorders or anything yet. Anecdotally, people love it and swear by it, and if that help makes you feel better, that's fine for you. But as a scientist, we don't have data to support that. So we are only looking in our studies at 25 milligrams. I think the issue, and I do believe this is in the guidance document as well, is, you can't just do a psilocybin versus placebo trial, right? Because if you tell someone you're going to get psilocybin or placebo, most people are going to figure it out. And there's a huge amount of concern around expectancies. This is an issue in all clinical trials, regardless of if it's psychedelics or not. Even if you give someone a standard antidepressant, so an SSRI, and you tell them that it's an effective treatment versus you tell them it's a placebo, you can see differences in brain connectivity, right? And this is a drug you can't even feel that you're on. So this is a big concern for us, is dealing with expectancies, especially, people who are consuming media that's telling them that psychedelics are going to cure all their things. How do we manage that in a clinical trial where we're like, you might get that thing that's going to cure all the things, or a placebo, right? Like you just can't really move forward with that.
Yeah. Yeah, that nocebo effect's also been brought up in the FDA guidance, which is, people are expecting and hoping they get the active control, and then they don't, and then that sort of exaggerates their negative effects, which is a real challenge even with the pharma industry, because they've been doing this also for many decades, and designing those clinical trials has always been a challenge.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to, right now, people like psychedelics generally have a favorable reputation. So that expectancy is kind of working in our favor as far as clinical outcomes. But what happens if that changes and the public perception of psychedelics becomes less favorable? Does that mean suddenly our trials are going to become less favorable, even if we're designing them the exact same? Is that kind of external expectancy going to really be driving our outcomes? And, we just don't know yet.
I was going to comment, I guess, Harpreet, on your questions about dose. And think about doses for MDMA. And the reason I guess I wanted to bring it back to that is because I actually think it's a really interesting question. And it's kind of weird to me that the majority of as far as I know, all of the MDMA assisted psychotherapy clinical trials have used fixed doses. And yet there's data showing weight-based effects on MDMA outcomes. And so it's interesting to me that that's the case for MDMA, whereas for psilocybin, they're largely weight-based doses. And so I wonder if part of that is just who has been responsible for doing the research in the clinical space, that the majority of the early trials that were done in the psilocybin assisted therapy trial were done by people who had a background in human behavioral pharmacology. And so they were more interested in those kind of details, whereas MAPS have been very clear that they, part of their thinking was around translation. And that's why they wanted a fixed dose, because it's very hard to get a weight-based dosing happening for translation and implementation. Whereas for us, it's a real issue because particularly the population that we work with, it's young adults. So it's over a period where there's quite a lot of there's extremes. So we get, very, very slight people in that period and larger people in that age period. And so we can really end up, if we were going to use fixed dosing, with underdosing or overdosing people. And for MDMA as well, like there seems to be a sort of sweet spot where under it produces slightly anxiogenic effects and over it produces slightly more sedative effects. And also increases risk of adverse events. So for us, we really had to go with weight-based dosing because we felt like that was so important given the population. But it certainly has been challenging to do that.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, actually. I think there's also the question of, and I have to admit, I'm not an expert on psilocybin. I also I've read a lot of MDMA literature, but there's a lot of dose PK relationship for MDMA that exists versus for psilocybin. And I wonder if that also plays a role in how these trials are continuing to progress versus, actually doing it the way you're doing, Jill, which is different people have different weights and need different amounts of drugs. And I mean, pharmacologically, that makes complete sense to me. But when I'm thinking about companies trying to get their drug to the market, how much does that hurt or help them is what it, I think, boils down to most of the time. So please continue your work. We're really looking forward to your research. It'll help everybody. And I hope it opens more doors than, yeah. I actually want to try and conclude our talk in the next maybe 10 minutes and leave some time for our questions if we have. I wanted to quickly touch upon, what are the challenges and opportunities that you see in this space, especially with the regulations constantly evolving, and also from the supply chain perspective, because like you said, Jill, in Australia, MDMA for PTSD is Schedule 8, psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression is Schedule 8, but everything else, any new indication you're studying, any new patient population, it's still Schedule 9. It's still a clinical trial, right? And in Canada, I don't think that's changed either, Leah, right? With the SAP, it's case-by-case basis, doctors can get that approval. So how do you manage this? Have you faced challenges in supply chain? What are the challenges? What are the different opportunities that you see here? I think clinical design we've touched upon, which is really evaluating the dose, the body weight and everything. But yeah, I'll leave the floor to you now.
Yeah, at least in the context of psilocybin, I think if you had asked me this question a few years ago, the biggest issue would be like access to GMP quality product. Turns out that's not an issue, at least in Canada. We have our pick of different providers, which is very nice. So for us, like we don't have that's not an issue anymore. It used to be the biggest problem. Now it's something that we worry the least about, one of the smaller hurdles that we have to come over. So I think that's interesting. I mean, I know it's not the same everywhere. There are a lot of companies located in Canada, which is very convenient for me, but I know for other people located maybe in Australia or the US, it's a little bit more work. And with Pharmala around, we also have an MDMA, one of the MDMA suppliers in Canada. So I kind of lucked out, I guess, in that regard for our clinical trials. But I think, in other places, it's probably a little bit more difficult.
Right.
In Australia, I would totally I agree with Leah that a couple of years ago, when we first started the process of trying to work out where we would get our MDMA from, it was very, very challenging. And at that stage, there was basically MAPS or there was no one. And then we discovered Pharmala. So that was helpful, but certainly not a range of different providers. And there are challenges associated with importing API and product of this type. I think now one of the TGA the changes that seems to have happened is that we're going to have easier access onshore to the medications, and that will actually make a big difference, because hopefully it will bring the prices down and avoid some of the issues around how long it takes to import, et cetera, et cetera. So I think supply chain, I think the TGA decision, the only thing that it has made better for us going forward is likely improving the supply chain. So.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, we have a joint venture in Australia where we'll be manufacturing on site in Australia through Cortexa. And then I'm sure you're aware of this, but I've also meant to ask you this. With psilocybin, the one question I keep asking a lot of researchers is psilocybin is not very stable relative to MDMA. I mean, MDMA's got beautiful shelf life, but with psilocybin, it does convert to psilocin. And I know we've got manufacturers who make, naturally derived psilocin in Canada. We've got manufacturers who make synthetic psilocybin. I mean, Pharmala has a partnership with Mindset Pharma, who've made synthetic psilocybin, and we supply psilocybin to clinical researchers. But in your experience, what have you seen those challenges in terms of stability and shelf life for psilocybin? And what are your thoughts on the natural versus synthetic psilocybin?
Well, we're not far enough along yet to worry about shelf life. We're still getting it on our shelves. But again, I think this is one advantage of being in Canada, very close to local producers, right? Like we don't have to do one giant shipment and like hope we can finish the study before the product is like no longer stable. So that's one thing. The natural versus synthetic, I don't really have I have no skin in this game. I get some people are really into, it needs to be, tightly regulated synthetics. We know precisely. Some people say like coming from the natural source is best because maybe there's entourage effects. Again, this same thing echoes back to cannabis debates too. And we just don't know scientifically like what is, if there is an advantage or not. So I think that's just, for me, I would need like empirical evidence. It's very scientific, boring science response, but I would need scientific evidence to like really lobby hard for one versus the other.
Fair. That's fair. Yeah. I mean, yeah, the entourage effect with cannabis is so different than psilocybin, but it keeps coming up often. And I'm the same as you, which is please show me some evidence. But I'm also constantly wondering, you know, when researchers are choosing the drug supply, what are their thoughts and how do they determine that? And if it's purely GMP and, you know, stable for the duration of their study, then the supply chain is not, like you said, in Canada, you can get access. You don't need to have a bulk shipment and then dose patients and things like that. I think that, yeah, that makes sense to me. In terms of opportunities, do these guidances help or hurt? Simply.
So I mean, I don't think they help particularly, or I mean, I think they help in terms of framing the starting point, and I think it's good that they're in draft, they're not for implementation, they're for comment. There is a need to really work out some of the ideas flesh out some of the ideas better in the guidance. One thing that I feel like needs to be emphasized really strongly is the question of mechanism. And that's something that I have been really focused on for quite a while now, because, you know, whereas I think for other medications like SSRIs, for instance, it's helpful for us to know what the mechanism is, but it's not imperative, because it's not going to change how the medications are used. We know that they work in a certain format, and so they're administered, and that's the way we do them. For this particular approach, you know, the reality is that without knowing what the mechanism is, we don't know where and how to do the psychotherapy. And so for me, that is really the big question that we need to be focusing on more, is to understand what is the mechanism of action, or what are likely the plural mechanisms of action, so that we can then optimize the type of psychotherapy that we offer and what the placement of the psychotherapy is. You know, there are some arguments that certain mechanisms would suggest that we don't need the psychotherapy at all. And, you know, maybe we find that out by doing these kind of factorial designs that the FDA propose. But my sense is that that's probably not the case, or we'd have a whole bunch of extremely mentally healthy rave attendees over the last 20 years, which, you know, we don't. So I think that there is some component, obviously, of psychotherapy that's important, but we need to know what that is and how best to do it.
Cool.
Yeah, and I think, kind of to jump off that, one thing that always kind of, I don't say frustrates, but worries me is like all of this concern around access to the medication or whatever, but there's very little focus on kind of education and training of people who are administering this, right? Like your current physicians or, you know, psychiatrists, they haven't been trained on psychedelics. Nobody has that information. So especially as we're letting, you know, individual practitioners prescribe this to patients, you know, what does that practitioner know about psychedelics? And, you know, we talked about some of the potential adverse safety events. And I feel like a lot of this conversation is like kind of dropped by the wayside when we're talking about access and like what's the right psychotherapeutic component, and, you know, how are we going to actually educate people on how to do this? Because I think that the need to educate people forces us to really decide what is important, what is evidence-based, and what are things that we just don't know, and actually put that in writing versus you know, speculation. So I think, you know, not only the you know, healthcare providers who's writing the prescription for it, but then again, as Jill was saying, the psychotherapeutic component, you know, I've tried to look into the various training programs, and they're interesting, but I don't know if they're necessarily evidence-based. And that worries me because, you know, I don't even know, for my clinical trials, we have to train people on the job, because there's nowhere for me to send people to be trained effectively in this thing that feels like it's about to be kind of unleashed to everyone.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask you, you know, both you and Jill, but the everybody's hoping MAPS gets the approval next year, and by the sounds of it, they most likely will. The floodgates are going to open at that point, and then I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on, you know, what next, because there's so much that needs to happen. We've discussed, you know, the dosing regimen, how it should be defined and how it should be studied. We've discussed the set and setting. We've discussed the need of having trained therapists with evidence-based therapy protocols. We've discussed the different indications and, you know, different patients needing different things. And how do we go from here? Where do we go from here?
I think it's going to be interesting times, to be honest. I think these issues are not going to go away, and if we consider sort of my understanding of the MAPS plan, that they're proposing under the approval would be that people who are doing the therapy would do their training, but then once they've done the training, they can just do anything they want. And they've said that quite explicitly, that they think people should be able to do different types of training, different types of therapy as well, not just what they're doing. So to me, that's conceptually quite problematic, because I don't, if it's not their training, if it's not their approach, why are they insisting on training people doing this if they actually think that people can do any kind of therapy with this? So I do think it has the potential to be quite a mess, actually. I think it really does, if the floodgates do open. And I think what Leah was saying before about the fact that there is no agreement on what constitutes appropriate treatment for this. And in Australia, the guidance from the College of Psychiatrists, which just came out in June, is in some ways kind of hilarious, because there are aspects of it where they're like, this is how it has to be. But then, they must undertake comprehensive training in psychedelic assisted therapies, and it goes through all the things they must do. And then it says, we have not currently endorsed or developed or endorsed any specific training program, but we'll provide further information later. So it's very clear that, there is no agreed upon training. And so from that perspective, I do think, I hope things become clearer soon, but I don't know that they're going to in the near future.
All right. Leah, any thoughts?
No, I mean, I totally agree. I think that, I don't know, the enthusiasm's good in some regard, but it also, I don't know, I'm a bit worry prone. I worry about what's going to happen as this is unleashed, because once it's out there, you can't pull it back. And we've kind of seen, how, I mean, in my opinion, how the kind of medical cannabis thing has derailed. And I don't want that to happen again.
Yeah.
But it feels like, a bit like shouting into the void, because like things are moving, it's happening, so it feels like it's really difficult to change trajectory at this point. So we'll see, I think, very soon how this is going to kind of roll out.
Well, I want to thank both of you for your time. I mean, I want to open up the floor for questions, but before that, I just want to say that, this webinar has been very informational. I hope that people who are listening, especially anybody from the industry, takes the clues and guidances and issues that have been brought up, because they really need to be addressed. I know at Pharmala, we focused a lot on the safety aspect, and we're constantly, making sure that whatever we do addresses most of the concerns that we've discussed here today, actually. And it's important that more research happens, and it is scary, it is daunting, but I also think it's exciting, because this is when you have guidances and regulations changing, that you can actually, you need the funds to do the work, you need the legalization to be able to really move fast in this domain, and remove that stigma that still exists to a certain degree with these molecules. So I know it's daunting, but I also think it's exciting. So with that, Conway, do we have questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll dive into the first one, just looking at the time. The PAC Center in Australia is providing MDMA therapy via Pharmala. Their therapists have been trained by Ben Sesa. What model of therapy does he teach? MAPS? That's the first question.
So I know that Ben has involvement with MAPS. I don't believe that he teaches exactly the MAPS approach. I have not seen any treatment manual produced by Ben or the work that he does, so I'm not totally sure what approach he's taking. I don't know if you are, Leah?
No, likewise. I think in a lot of the studies, it's just kind of psychotherapeutic support, however that is defined to you. So.
Moving on to the next question. One good thing about MAPS is that it provides some quality control. It might not be enough quality, but they were the gatekeepers by requiring people to do their training to access their MDMA. How do we replicate their gatekeeping, but with more quality training programs?
think
I mean, get a training program of some sort. I think that's where the investment needs to go, is just like, there needs to be something, all these, regulatory bodies say that you need to be trained, but on what, how? So I think that's where money really should be funneled, is to figure out, how do we train people and what does that look like? Because just because something exists doesn't necessarily mean it's good, but we can't really evaluate that until we put some effort into really kind of, making something that people can actually dig into.
Totally, and I also think one of the challenges with that is going to be getting people to agree on what constitutes appropriate training. I think is something that there's been a lot of different perspectives on, and there are, some of the psychotherapeutic approaches that are employed are really vastly different from some of the other psychotherapeutic approaches. And so, there was a paper, I think a couple of years ago, from the Hopkins team, arguing that cognitive behavioral therapy should be the basic approach for this work. And there were people who were pretty upset about that. So it's going to be, I think we're going to have to negotiate some form of consensus and then develop the training programs.
Cool. I think we have time for one more question. If anyone wants to drop that in the Q&A. Other than that, that's it for questions today.
Awesome. Thank you both. I know it's very early for Leah, and Jill, it's late night for you. So I really, really appreciate you guys taking time from your busy schedules to have this call with us. Conway, thank you for putting everything together. Couldn't have done it without your support. And yeah, I mean, if you don't have any questions, I can give everybody some time back.
Yeah.
Thanks for the invitation too. It was a nice way to start my morning.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Nice way to finish the day. So
Thank you.